Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Joe Biden's final job report is out, and it's a doozy, a veritable orgy of revisions, kicking off with a massive Bureau of Labor Statistics revision that wiped out 589,000 imaginary jobs the Biden administration had been propping up until the election. Every single month of 2024 was revised down, and keep in mind, this is not the whole story. The Philly Fed thinks there's another 800,000 fake jobs lurking in the sweet nothings of Biden's finest government statisticians. Trump's new chief economist, Kevin Hassett, summed it up, quote, "The Biden job market was way worse than markets thought. There is a lot of cleaning up to do." Democrats and legacy media, of course, tried to pin the whole mess on Trump, terming it as, quote, Trump's first job report when it covers the period before Trump even took office, and revises numbers Biden invented. Now, even more concerning than the revisions was job composition. Nearly 70% of new jobs were either government workers or government-funded education and social assistance, what the Wall Street Journal calls the welfare industrial complex. Just 45,000 jobs were created outside government out of an economy of 164 million workers. That is roughly one-third what the economy needs just to tread water. Note, all those government-funded jobs will have been bought with tax dollars. The government, of course, creates absolutely nothing. It only steals. This pumps up the national debt, which we will either have to repay with higher taxes or, as Biden had been doing, with inflation. Once again, full-time jobs were replaced by part-time jobs, a theme under Biden. Government counts both as a job, of course, but most people take part-time jobs because they can't find a full-time job, and yet they still need to eat. Finally, the report found that precisely 99.2% of new jobs in January went to foreign-born workers. Just 0.8% went to the native-born, who make up 4/5 of Americans' population and, in theory, 90% of America's voters, in case Dems wonder why they lost. So what's next? Warren Buffett famously quipped that when the tide goes out, we see who's swimming without a suit. There will be a lot more revisions as we discover just how deep the lies and statistical manipulations went under Biden, starting with that 800,000 revision by the Philly Fed. Still, what's more important is help is on the way. Trump's spending cuts, tax cuts, regulatory cuts, and mass deportations will all lead to more jobs for Americans. Yes, even for the hundreds of thousands of redundant federal workers who will go from a monkey on the back of the private sector to actually doing something useful with their lives. So in the coming months, expect a lot of the numbers to get much worse on paper with the revisions, even as our job market starts healing, reversing Biden's handlers' wholesale government takeover, and freeing Americans to get back to making things again. However corrupt you think the federal government is, turns out it is worse than you think. Zero Hedge reports that last week, staffers at the left-wing webzine Politico, famous for claiming the Hunter Biden laptop was a hoax, were notified a, quote, technical error had prevented paychecks from going out. Many joked this had something to do with the Trump administration putting a freeze on funding by the left's $40 billion slush fund USAID, which is allegedly a development agency, but apparently is a universal basic income for the radical left. Well, a couple ex-users decided to dig in, and it turns out Politico had, in fact, been getting tens of millions of funding from USAID, as well as the rest of the federal government. To the point, Politico is essentially a taxpayer-funded propaganda mill. These included $10,000 per year pro-subscriptions, almost entirely paid by governments, and in all, it was roughly $30 million going to Politico that we've found so far. One commentator at the National Pulse estimated up to 90% of Politico subscriptions are either fake or taxpayer-funded. Of course, Politico was just the tip of the iceberg. As they kept digging, they found millions going to the New York Times and the BBC, which is not even American. In fact, they found $473 million paid from USAID to 4,291 media outlets around the world, all of them left-wing. The money also funded advertiser boycotts against any non-left media, including famously targeting Elon Musk's X platform for failing to censor speech. Beyond the dollars and the obvious corruption, the concern is what exactly does the deep state get for these millions? Election interference, state-funded propaganda on an industrial scale, the censorship industrial complex itself. After all, if the regime narrative is slavishly pumped out by the New York Times and BBC with their prestige, that gives the left ammo to censor alternative voices as so-called misinformation. This could range from COVID censorship to war propaganda, Slava Ukraine, to covering up the corruption fueling the entire radical left. So what's next? When DOGE first came along, I was mostly excited about its potential to take the edge off inflation by reducing government spending while getting rid of stupid regulations so the economy can grow. I did not anticipate what's turning out to be even more important, which is exposing the hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars funding the entire left. At this point, we might wonder if the radical left is in entirety a tax-funded scam and on a worldwide level, pushing communism and national suicide because there's money in it for a literal army of tax-funded radical. We're just 3 weeks into DOGE, and they've already found more than the accumulated investigative efforts of our entire crony media complex. 4 years of this, and I wonder if the radical left will even exist. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. In the new year, it's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. With Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/Peter. You've heard me talk about the need to protect yourself from inflation and central bank currency debasement. Instead of parking your wealth and eroding dollars, there's an alternative: saving and earning interest every month in gold and silver with monetary metals. Gold and silver owners can earn between 2 and 4% on metal leases paid in more ounces of gold and silver. Accredited investors can earn up to 19% in monetary metals precious metal bond offerings. That's real, tangible wealth earning interest every month. This is more than just preserving your wealth. This is growing it in gold and silver that cannot be devalued by the Fed. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn how to put your gold and silver to work today. Now back to our show. Bond markets, the ultimate judge and executioner of financial crises, are starting to think Donald Trump can actually fight inflation and stave off a financial collapse that was looking inevitable under Joe Biden's handlers. Will our corrupt economic aristocracy be issuing apologies? So specifically, the yield or the interest rate on the 10-year bond is collapsing. This is a good thing because it's a kind of thermometer warning of any fiscal crisis. Why the 10-year? Because 10 years is long enough to boil out the noise from the economic cycle, the boom-bust, and it tells you what's structurally happening with the economy. That means 3 things: economic growth, inflation, and the odds our government will default on the national debt. That could be a so-called soft default, meaning they let inflation run hot to melt away the debt, or a hard default, where they literally issue IOUs like several states did in the 2008 crisis. Now, under Joe Biden, the 10-year had been marching up relentlessly, which is bad. The main driver, of course, was inflation, which has been stuck around 3% for the past year. Along with Biden's eye-watering $2 trillion budget deficits that were raising fears that markets could not digest all of that debt. These took the 10-year from 1.1% on Biden's inauguration day to 4.3% by the recent election. After a brief dip following Trump's win, the 10-year then started grinding up, hitting 4.8% 3 weeks later, as the left-wing media Borg pumped fear porn that Trump's tariffs would hike inflation, while his tax cuts would raise deficits and stress Treasury markets. The fear porn, it turns out, failed. The yield is now collapsing down a half point in just a couple weeks, and almost back to the pre-election number. So what's driving the good news? It's certainly not the Fed itself, which is now signaling it won't be cutting rates anytime soon, so that boosts the 10-year. Instead, the good news is coming from rising growth expectations and falling inflation expectations as markets realize DOGE is actually making real cuts in federal spending for the first time since Bill Clinton. Meanwhile, Trump's new Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is also doing all the right things, pushing for a so-called 3-3-3 plan that aims for 3% economic growth, which is robust, a 3% fiscal deficit, which implies a $1 trillion cut in spending, and ramping up drilling by 3 million barrels of oil per day, which brings energy prices down, which then lowers the price of everything from food to factories to electricity bills. So what's next? Right now, the 10-year is warming to Trump on growth, inflation, and government spending. If Trump can get his agenda through Congress in terms of crisis, we are out of the woods. We can even grow into the debt, or even, dare we dream, start paying it down. Still, between here and there, it will get choppy. Growth itself raises inflation in the short run through loan creation, and even deregulation and tariffs can be temporarily inflationary as they rejigger production and supply chains. So don't be surprised if we get another jump in the 10-year, which media will jump on like vultures. But for now, markets are forecasting a Goldilocks economy with solid growth, tame inflation, and a brightening fiscal picture. That's quite a bit in just 3 weeks. A new bombshell report from Congress itself finds that $516 billion of annual federal spending goes to programs whose legal authority from Congress has expired. In some cases, it expired 40 years ago. Now, for perspective, $516 billion is roughly 7 times the income tax paid by the bottom half of Americans on expired programs. The study is from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, which finds 2,500 expired appropriations that continue getting funded like zombies by Congress. So when Congress creates a program or agency, it has to give it legal permission called authorization. This sets the goals, objectives, and limitations of each program or agency. It's often for a fixed period, after which technically Congress no longer legally recognizes the program for funding, unless it is reauthorized, which requires a fresh vote by Congress. Now that matters because the fresh vote is where Congress has to take responsibility for the program. Is it actually achieving its goals and objectives? Being the federal government, the answer is almost certainly no. So instead, Congress just keeps the money flowing and nobody says nothing. It's shady, but it also means obsolete programs keep getting funding, apparently for generations. The programs are pretty much what you'd expect. $94 billion on, quote, education and workforce, including $10 billion for, quote, workforce innovation and $8 billion for left-wing universities. $62 billion on, quote, foreign affairs, which we are now seeing from USAID is almost entirely grift. $32 billion in, quote, science, space, and technology. You may remember them back when you couldn't use the word vaccine online. $53 billion in, quote, financial services, so no Wall Street bankers left behind. And $53 billion in expired programs of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice to keep Patriot Front in clean pants. So what's next? We already know the federal government is corrupt and wasteful, although I think many Americans, including me, are surprised just how bad it is. The key question is, can Trump refuse to spend money on expired programs? In other words, can he book a quick $516 billion of savings? Now, Washington's habit has, of course, been to spend everything, but legally, any program without authorization lacks what's called legislative intent. Essentially, it's as if they accidentally funded an expired program. That would mean Trump decides which ones deserve funding in his role as fiduciary steward of the federal government, potentially striking hundreds of billions of waste and fraud. This matters because Democrats are planning to use upcoming budget negotiations to try and strong-arm Trump into, among other things, crippling the DOGE anti-corruption crusade. Thing is, if Dems play hardball and block a budget, it means an additional $900 billion of spending authorization also expires, including the entire military budget. If that happens, almost the entire discretionary budget loses legislative intent, pretty much everything aside from Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. The taxes would still flow in, so Trump would have plenty of money to spend, in fact too much, but Congress will have essentially said they have no opinion what he spends it on, if he spends it at all. In Trump 1.0, the left ran circles blocking him with lawfare. So far in Trump 2.0, we are seeing Trump and Elon running circles around the left. If they lawyer this right, we could see historic cuts to the federal government, something polls say 3/4 of Americans very much want. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Last week, Donald Trump's base spokesperson, Caroline Leavitt, announced his tax plans for the coming year. It is a beauty. So while Congress writes tax law, presidents set out the kind of bill they would like to see from Congress, at which point it becomes a back and forth between the White House and the drunk sailors, with the White House currently having the upper hand, given it is a GOP Congress and Trump has 90% plus support among Republican voters. So his proposal is to extend his first-term tax cuts, along with 5 new cuts, and closing 2 tax loopholes on special interest. So the new cuts are no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no tax on Social Security payments, along with adjusting the so-called SALT cap that hits rich people in blue states, and a new tax cut specifically for made-in-America products. Meanwhile, the tax hikes are eliminating sweetheart rates for hedge funds called carried interest and getting rid of breaks for billionaire sports team owners, which I guess is a pet project for the Don. As always with Trump, the cuts are exactly what he promised on the campaign trail, and cutting tax on tips and overtime very specifically aims that sweet tax cut goodness at his working class base who earn tips and overtime. Now, this is massively popular since Americans of all parties do like helping working class people who actually work. Even more popular is Trump's no tax on Social Security payments, given that it's double taxing money we already paid. In fact, given the actual rates of return on Social Security are something like 1/4 of investing it on your own, it's pretty rich that they steal 3/4 of your retirement and then tax you for the swindle. The SALT cap is a bit more complicated. The original idea was limit how much federal taxes rich people in blue states can deduct for the state taxes they pay. That was effectively a federal subsidy to blue states like California and New York, and Trump reined it in. Still, as you'd expect, blue state voters hate the SALT cap, so Trump's using it as a bargaining chip to bring on suburban Republicans and maybe even some Dems. So put it together and you've got 3 massively popular tax cuts, tips, overtime, Social Security, and a SALT adjustment that is tactically popular. Now, the trick in tax cuts is that tax cuts that boost growth, like business tax and capital gains, are not very popular because they're easy to demonize given they reward investing in economic growth and rich people are the ones who invest. So ideally, you want to mix the high-impact tax cuts with the popular one. That's hopefully where Trump's Made in America cuts come in. They're a very elegant way to frame cuts in business tax for what they are, a way to make the country more prosperous, in contrast to the left's Marxist class war distributionist framing. So what's next? Trump 2.0 is getting very good at communicating his goals. Assuming he does what I think he will, pairing high-impact cuts with popular cuts, Trump stands a very good chance of getting his cuts into law and making a big impact on economic growth. As for the long game, Trump has repeatedly said he would like to get rid of the entire income tax. Exempting broad categories moves us a lot closer, and if tariffs and DOGE can make enough progress cutting spending and raising revenue, it actually becomes possible. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersaintange.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.